Resolve an interdisciplinary design collective. We work between architecture, art, and engineering to address social issues. And a lot of the work we do, in fact, all the work we do revolves around communities and working with and in communities. This began around working with young people, but expanded to a number of different demographics. And regardless of who we're working with and what age we're working with, there is a focus on local and working in people's locals and working with local value. That work takes a number of different forms. And it can be spatial, as it often is, kind of manifesting in the disruption of space or creation of new spaces within old regimes. It's always process-led, so always looking at work that values local experience and local knowledges as well, and local materials. And often can take a kind of a whirlwind of form. So increasingly it's working with digital media, working with film, working with a number of different types of media and types of practices as well that we incorporate as a result of also where we came from, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The work that we do always revolves around this idea of using the site as a resource. That's a design philosophy that we employ in all of our work, regardless of what form it takes. That includes a kind of valuing local knowledge and also valuing local materials as well, working in ways to do both those things simultaneously. So whether we're building structures, whether we're doing murals, whether we are working with digital and websites as well, which is kind of increasingly something that we do, whether it is through essay writing and research, it's always around this idea of using the site as a resource. And that, I think, is the base behind this idea of practicing infrastructurally. So this original presentation had explored three themes in the work to relocate that idea, the understanding of practicing in a way in which we can redistribute value, a way in which we can be dissipative with the value that we have, and a way that platforms a lot of the other groups that we work in and around. I realized this presentation was quite long, and so I've chopped up a fair whack of that. So we're going to go through two of the three themes, and then go into a deep dive about one project in particular that I think kind of really realizes that. So starting from the ends. Starting from the ends is a process which started off as a project. I think it might start off as an individual project, but has now become a kind of umbrella theme for a lot of our work and also our beginnings. We started work in Brixton in South London. We're from a place in Streatham in South London, where if anyone knows South London and Streatham, you grow up in Streatham and your universe starts with Brixton and it ends with Croydon. And so in this world is where we started working in our own ends, what you call your ends in London, in our own neighbourhood. And this first project was part of the London Design Festival in 2016. It was working in St Matthew's Church Gardens in Brixton. And we wanted to create a temporary pavilion that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, that hosted a number of different talks, events, film screenings, artist exhibitions as well, as a way of platforming a number of the different groups that we had kind of come up with, had started scheming with. And although now we work in quite a formal way within the architectural realm, I'd say, we teach in an architectural school, we work in a lot of different architectural projects. A lot of the groups that we came up around were anything but that, and the groups that we still consider our kind of extended family, our collective, are artists, performers, musicians, zine makers, so a real breadth. And so we really wanted to create ways to platform those ambitions, to platform the ambitions and the kind of practices of those around us. And so we created that 7 day and 7 night program as a way of doing that, with a different artist exhibition every morning and with different mornings and a different event every evening as well. And so programming became a part of design for us. Programming as a way of activating space, of disrupting the normative kind of regimes of space as well, became as inherent to us as designing. And with this design in particular, what we tried to do was use materials that we could only source from within a mile radius of the site. And so both those constraints, the programmatic constraint and the physical constraint, became these kind of starting points for us in our journey. The next project we ever did was in Brixton as well. And Brixton is where we worked, and where we only worked for the first couple of years of our collective lives. And this was a project in Brixton Market, a place that we know well, a place that's the epicenter of Africa, one of the epicenters of Afro-Caribbean identity in London and in the UK. And we were really interested in this idea of market value, not the value that of our homes and kind of the financialization of land, but rather what value do urban markets bring to today? Alternative forms of value, not fiscal value, but social value, environmental value, historical and political value, etc. And so in order to do this, what we wanted to try and do was use an essential part of the market infrastructure, these banana boxes, and turn those into an internal space structure. So using between 300 and 400 of these boxes, we set an armature for this abandoned space within the market, between two parts of the market, as a platform for different workshops and talks, events that were happening all around this idea of food production in the city, but as a way of asking these kind of more deep questions around market value, around the value of our markets today. The workshops and the talks as well were also a way of platforming, and we tried to have a rolling program. So we worked within the means of the site. We really tried to employ this idea of the site of the resource as in people resourcing, and ended up having lots and lots of ad hoc events where people who would come in with something, with an idea, and would end up kind of exacting that within that same week as well. So a really interesting way of doing those things. So from music and performances to parties as well, any number of these things we were working with. One of the essential ideas within the project as well, and something that carried on in the legacy of some of those projects, was this platforming idea. This is the work of an artist called Shola Olulade, who was from down the road from us, where we were. And this was one of the first times that she had exhibited. And she's a really amazing artist. I really love her work. But for us, it was about sharing the opportunity. We had this space, by whatever means we had it in, we were occupying this space, and sharing the opportunity that we had was integral to what we did. It was integral in almost a philosophical sense. We didn't see ourselves as artists. And prior to this, and for some time after this, we hadn't worked in any formal artist spaces. So we had never called ourselves artists or envisioned ourselves having anything to do with the art world, inverted commas. But platforming and sharing opportunities with people around us who we thought were artists, people around us who kind of deemed their practices as artistic, was kind of highly important. The next one on this, like the kind of explication of the theme starting from the ends, is around an ends that isn't ours, it's Sheffield, but one that became a kind of adopted area for us. And so we had a project in Sheffield, the first time that we'd ever worked in a formal institution. This was in 2018. And it was around this idea of emotional mapping, a term that we developed from the mapping of Kevin Lynch, who was an urban planner in the 70s and 60s in LA, and developed this composite citizen imagery, a way of mapping people's connections and ideas of where their homes were, where they were. We wanted to kind of lift this and augment this, taking it away from formal kind of iconography, and really understanding or embracing the performativity of mapping collectively. And so we worked with a number of different groups in Sheffield. We produced these emotional maps, which were kind of evince people's connections to their local areas. It became a way of us seeing Sheffield for the first time, and us kind of seeing Sheffield through other people's eyes, really kind of valuing the subjectivity of how different people see Sheffield. And then we created a space out of this. So then we sought a number of different spatial ways, constructive ways, of understanding people's emotional responses to their city. So this emerged within the space in S1 Art Space in Park Hill, which is of its own kind of historical significance, in a number of different ways, and also accompanied a 2-month program of public work, of public events and performances, and also exhibitions as well, to explore these different ideas of how people are connected to their city, how people are emotionally connected to their cities. And those ends then became our ends. And so that was a really important part for us, because that was the first time we had ever worked out of London. That was the first time we had ever worked out of Brixton. And this had become a kind of adopted home for us, and learning from these other places, learning from other locals, starting from other people's ends, it had become equally important as this conversation that we were having between being locals and being designers as well. That conversation is kind of broadened in the advent of COVID, and also what's going on where community engaged practices also kind of employ technological means. And so this was a project that we did for Croydon, a project in Purley Way, when we were looking at understanding people's connections to Purley Way, a really interesting site in Croydon. But we did that through the creation of a digital mapping platform whereby people could post and share their memories, and also see other memories, so engage in a dialogue of kind of posting, a mimetic dialogue around their kind of sites. around their homes. The second theme I wanted to go into was material lives. I'm not going to go into the third theme of platforming. So material lives is another kind of sub-theme within the work. So like starting from the ends, it developed as a way of us explaining what we're doing, a way of us explaining why we're messing around with kind of waste materials so much, why we're doing all this kind of slightly random things when it comes to the creation and using materials. But material lives then became this umbrella term for how we can understand the use and employment of materials. Really, when we're working with materials, especially within spatial context, the question we're not asking is what do materials do for us? We're asking what stories do materials tell about us? And so by using these waste materials, by using surplus materials and using materials that happen in local areas, we try and tell a story, we try and read a story, try and investigate the narratives around place. Some of those ways exemplified in these projects. So this was a project that we did in collaboration with Tate Collective and Tent Gallery in Rotterdam, where they were interested in this idea of the corner shop as a site of cultural production. And so we use corner shop boxes, crisp boxes from across London, from all kind of corners of London. We were rummaging around London for a really long period of time and in the night to find these things, trying to interact with the flows of these corner shops as well, trying to understand when and where they didn't need these boxes too. So really trying to be in with the rhythms of waste within the city and these kind of various ecologies. And we also used this as a way of getting our own material within the gallery. So we exploited a kind of small loophole within this idea of acquisitions and literature acquisitions that was separate from our program, our kind of production budget. And we were able to get the work of a lot of the groups that we work with, Art Collective, Skin Deep, The Funambulist, Eyesore, into the after party, into the permanent collections of the museum through this kind of through this way. So using materials in lots of different ways. Another way, this was a project that we did with the Science Gallery Young Advisors in 2019 or 2018, where they were really interested in this idea of anxiety as being this twofold phenomena. Anxiety in a cultural sense, so the collective experience of a diaspora when they're in highly urbanized places, potentially kind of losing their connection to their homes. And this idea of anxiety being obviously a neurological phenomena. And through that, we had a number of different conversations with researchers at King's College, which underpin some of this work. We use material, with the young advisors, they come up with the idea that the intersection, the nexus of these two experiences is in physical activity, drawing on the concepts of neuroplasticity in the brain, and simplifying that, really thinking about how an activity such as weaving could help us address and think through, reflect on this experience, this dual experience of anxiety. And so taking from charity shops in the local area around London Bridge, where this was, we worked a way of turning old clothes into reconstituted yarn with the young advisors, and then created a space within the gallery that became a series of loom walls through which people could physically and also metaphorically weave in and weave out of, using fabrics that we had collected from different diasporic markets across London. So from Brixton in the south, Ridley Road in the east, from Seven Sisters in the north, and Shepherd's Bush in the west as well. This space started off as quite a formal space, but over time, as people began weaving in and out of it, creating new orifices, kind of creating these new organic structures out of it as well, it took on an amorphous form of its own. We also ran in parallel a workshop with the Latin American Youth Forum, who are in Angeltown and Brixton, on weaving, and created our own loom wall with them. We found this physical activity not only to be the nexus of addressing things like anxiety in this, but also by bringing also a way of bringing organizational proximity between ours and theirs. There's an organization that we greatly admired, and by weaving and by kind of commencing in this physical activity, we found ways of kind of bringing closeness to both ourselves and this organization as well, overcoming language barriers as well. So a really important way in which material can do more than just its kind of functional activities. Finally, on this kind of sub-theme of materials, this was a project that we did in Braunschweig in Germany, which was quite personal for us. It was a really personal experience. We looked at the life of, we were invited to kind of look at the life of Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was an Afro-German philosopher in the 18th century. And we explored his philosophical tenets and also his life through a series of materials. We split the project up, so we had a way of kind of archiving some of his research and displaying that research as well within the space. We also took the project completely digitally as well, because it happened just before lockdown. And we created a digital platform which had the work and also the work of others on the lives of African Europeans between the 16th and early 19th century as well. And working with online digital formats, with an online kind of digital space, we were able to act synchronously as well and be in time with things that were temporal or ephemeral, so film screenings and talks and things. And so this applied another dimension to some of the work. We mapped out the space as well with a group of college students from Francis Feld, which is a local college. And this was the way in which we kind of sought to test and implement the space at the same time. So developing on some of Amo's philosophical principles and tenets, we then used this workshop as a way to turn those into material processes and left a lot of the residue of those processes, a lot of the vestiges of those processes in the space as well. And these took on a number of different forms, from reclaimed materials that we found from around the site. So from reconstituted yarn again, to using sand, to using pieces of glass, to the incorporation of plastic joints for old pieces of wood. So a number of different materials, which we tried to use as a way of interpreting these quite heavy, these quite complex philosophical tenets. Finally, on the materials live theme was a project that we completed recently last year with the design museums, Ardar Young Creatives. And this was a project where we worked with a series of really amazing young people, some really fantastic people. Even looking at the photo, it's kind of making me smile. Where we went on we did a 3-month journey with them, where we created a syllabus around this idea of care, but more pertinently asking this idea, who cares? And getting them to explore that through the use of kind of spatial methodologies as well. So throughout the series, we then culminated across the 3 months in a built project, whereby they used waste materials from around the site, kind of collected from all around the site, from different high street shops, from waste materials of the museum, to create a structure made of brick that was turned from paper and cardboard, and also bits of chipboard and things that we could find. So we compressed those into bricks. And that formed part of the structure as well. The structure was solely designed and built by the young people as well. So they had real authority in how it turned out and all the aesthetic decisions as well. And by gifting them, or by allowing them those, by allowing them to take on those decisions, and by ourselves kind of giving over that control and, switching that position from being the tutors or the teachers to actually kind of learning from that position. I think we were also able to realize, or they were also able to realize, an aesthetic that challenged this idea of material as being just functional, and really told these stories with the materials, stories of what it is to be a young person in the built environment, what it is to be a young person being kind of taught about the built environment as well, and a kind of number of other things. In relation to that, they also had a big program of events. So they made a zine. We collaborated with Press MK, a group that we had worked with in the past, to create an overnight zine, which is a process of taking different materials from around the space and turning that into a zine in one day. They also had a conference and a number of different things as well. And needless to say, it was a lot of fun. So the last part of the presentation, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on one particular project. I don't have too much time. And actually, Seth is here. So he can take over on this part. Seth, are you there?
Yes, I am. But I haven't got my my video unmuted. I don't know if that's on. My video is not on, but can you hear me? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm assuming.
I can hear you now.
Oh, sorry. I'm assuming so. Sorry. Okay. So the final deep dive that we'd like to go into is a project called Made on Location, which is a residency, a kind of a year-long residency that we entered with the V&A East. And the V&A East are a prospective new institution in East London that's erected from the investment that came from the Olympics, and now the kind of new development that's going in the area in Stratford. So our role was to think about the role of young people in the future of this museum, not just from a perspective of kind of attendance and quite a formal relationship, but actually be quite disruptive with how the institution can support young people and support the lives of young people. So we came up with a concept, or with a project approach that was called Made on Location, and was birthed from a thing we call starting from the ends. And by starting from the ends, we mean valuing and kind of supporting local knowledges, local understandings, and actually centering that in our creative practice. So the idea was that we work with young people from the 4 what they call Olympic boroughs, which is Waltham Forest, Tower Hamlets, Newham, and Hackney, and think about how we can centre their experiences and them as experts of their local area and build up this creative practice through that, and actually in doing that, challenge and kind of disrupt the nature and the relationship that the V&A currently have with them. So Made on Location, as I've just described, kind of was birthed from that thinking, and what we wanted to do was have a kind of practice-led residency, and by that I mean ensuring that we were working closely with young people from these areas, participating in different activities, running a series of workshops, which would then inform our research. So it was really important that we were kind of being really hands-on, and ensuring that these workshops were really like exploring the themes that we wanted to explore. And then after which that would culminate in a installation, a kind of piece that could then communicate and share some of the work and some of the information that the young people gave us, some of the kind of insights that the young people gave us on their area, but also importantly, communicate how we wanted to inform and challenge institutional strategy in the V&A. So the workshop started with a series of mapping exercises, which we have developed outside of the London context. So we've developed it in Sheffield, and since then we've taken it across a number of different areas. And this is really about valuing the local experience. And we move through this mapping exercise, starting from your home and going through your familiar roots and thinking about your memories and your experiences of this area. And that's a real way of kind of grounding our practice and our research in the experience of young people. We then took this and took the insights from that mapping exercise and put it toward an exercise in creative practice. So thinking about actually breaking down our own practice, our own influences, and think about how this like really intimate understanding of your local area can inform your creative practice, and how an institution like the V&A can support that. One of the things that was crucial to the project was not only to kind of work closely with young people, but actually work in their spaces to make sure that we were on the move, we were mobile, and we were actually latching on to existing programs. So here's a picture of where we worked really closely with Black Horse Road Responders, who've got an amazing youth program running. And we wanted to make sure that we're not kind of dropping in a new and kind of fairly entitled approach to youth engagement, but actually supporting existing organizations, existing spaces, and thinking about how the V&A, in whatever form it comes, can actually take a much more kind of flexible and a much more empathetic approach in the future. And again, we were fortunate enough to test this out with a number of different young people. So here's an image of us working closely with the young advisors that are attached to the museum, and are really already trying to challenge the museum to think more creatively and think more kind of strategically about this role of young people. And as I said, fortunately enough, and I guess this is where our role as practitioners come in, we got the opportunity to showcase this work in the current V&A Museum in West London. And the idea there was to think about the position that we have as a kind of a practitioner outside of the institution, but also the position that young people occupy. So this kind of outsider-insider relationship, and erect a structure that could showcase some of the research, showcase some of the aspirations, and showcase some of the opportunities and challenges of this relationship with young people that the V&A kind of sought out and were interested in knowing. So what we did was we used scaffolding from a local scaffolding provider, and we used material that we found from within the institution. So discarded material that was identified to be thrown away, to erect this structure that could house and host the information that we gathered and the kind of insight that we gathered throughout the residency. And we stitched some of the maps and projected some of these maps that the young people produced in the V&A as a way of really kind of paying testament to this knowledge and this understanding of their local area that we think is pivotal if we're really going to be talking about kind of this relationship in the future. But again, in trying to keep with our original principles, we made sure that we didn't, the installation at the V&A, what we call the V&A West, but in West Kensington, didn't kind of draw all of our attention, but actually we continued this dialogue between East London. So making sure that we weren't just focusing on the installation, but we're actually focusing on continuing these conversations. So we hosted a series of audio walks with the young people, where they could now kind of bring this map to life and show us some of the areas that they value currently. Because I think a massive conversation about valuing young people is about valuing the spaces that they inhabit, the spaces that they frequent, the spaces that they see valuable, which are currently experiencing challenges I think we're all familiar with. And then these are just some of the images of the previous walk. And we were, wanted to ensure that the space itself had that continuous dialogue. And not only that, but in being there, in existing, it was kind of, it had this feeling of not being settled. So to us, it was quite clear that this discourse was new to the V&A. And so our structure kind of sat quite awkwardly in the center of the V&A. It used, we kind of marbled scaffolding so that it reflected some elements, but really challenged these aesthetics that we've come used to. And finally, it just created an amazing platform for us to collaborate, kind of collaborate with our own ends, bringing our own ends into the V&A. And this is an event that we supported Sound Advice, who are a kind of really amazing zine and kind of organization that think about creating space, and not space in a formal sense, but space in all kinds of different senses for BIPOC people in the kind of design and architecture industry. Yeah.